The story of King Henry VIII's rule was shaped by two powerful desires: blood and power. In the cold winter of 1547, as his bloated body was failing from the inside, England's most infamous kings had to face his own death. He approached it with the same cold-hearted planning he had used to order the executions of two of his wives and many others who stood in his way. The lion is dying, members of his court would say in secret, but his power remained strong until his very last moments. This horrible end was a long way from where he started. Decades before, he was a handsome and athletic young prince, known all over Europe for his energy and charm. How did this celebrated young man change into the monstrous ruler who struggled for every breath in his candlelit rooms at Whitehall Palace? The reason is found not only in his well-known marriages, but also in a string of health disasters that twisted both his physical form and his state of mind in ways no one could have imagined. By January of 1547, Henry was hard to recognize as the same man who had once competed in jousting tournaments with the best knights in the Christian world. His body had turned into a war zone of sickness. His legs were covered in leaking sores that gave off a smell so bad that people in his court found it hard not to be sick in his presence. The king now needed special machines to help him move his massive body, which some reports claim had grown to weigh almost 400 pounds. His once handsome face had become twisted and swollen, his eyes sinking deep into his yellowish, unhealthy-looking skin. The royal doctors had tried every treatment they knew. They had tried letting his blood, giving him plant-based medicines, and saying prayers, but nothing worked against the mix of diseases that were taking over their king. Most historians today think Henry had type 2 diabetes, gout, and maybe a severe bone infection called osteomyelitis, which would account for the constant, terrible pain in his legs. Even more concerning was the decline of the king's mind. His famous bad temper had become worse, leading to fits of wild anger followed by times of sleepy confusion. Even as he was dying, the main concern at the royal court was who would take power next. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had given him the son he desperately wanted. A delicate 9-year-old boy named Edward. But strong groups at court were already trying to get in position to control the young boy once Henry was gone. The traditional Catholic group, led by the Duke of Norfolk, was in a power struggle with the Protestant reformers, who were led by Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle. Henry, who was paranoid until the end, knew all about these schemes. He was still signing orders for executions even when he was so weak he could barely hold a pen. The king's quickly worsening health was one of the biggest secrets in the kingdom. Official statements from the palace kept saying that Henry was healthy and strong. But the truth was very different. Anyone allowed to enter the king's sick room saw a grim picture. The huge royal bed was covered in dark cloth, and the air was filled with a sickly, sweet smell of rot, which burning incense could not completely hide. In the middle of it all was the massive shape of a man who had once been a symbol of England's strength. Palace staff whispered that they heard the king screaming in pain, his cries echoing down the stone halls of Whitehall. The sores on Henry's legs caused him such extreme pain that even the smallest motion could set off waves of agony. His doctors put poultices on his sores, made of everything from boiled onions to ground-up human skulls. These were desperate measures that only made his pain worse. What worked better was giving him large amounts of opium, which dulled the king's pain, but also made his confused mind even cloudier. The mental pain was just as bad as the physical pain. Henry had once been the most powerful man in England, with the ability to decide if his subjects lived or died. Now, he was powerless as his own body failed him. Court documents show that his behavior became more and more unpredictable. He had moments of near madness when he would talk about the ghosts of his executed enemies or call for wives who had been dead for years. When he was clearer in his mind, the king spent his time obsessively looking over his will, trying to control the future of his family line even after he was gone. People at court noticed with fear how the king switched back and forth between his religious beliefs in his final days. After breaking away from the Catholic Church in Rome to make himself the head of the Church of England, Henry now seemed tortured by religious uncertainty. One day he would ask for Catholic ceremonies, and the next he would strongly support Protestant ideas. His personal priest wrote that the king would wake up terrified from nightmares, saying he saw the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other people he had executed standing silently at the end of his bed, judging him. The king's approaching death created a risky power gap that his court members hurried to take advantage of. The Privy Council broke apart into competing groups, with each one trying to get into a better position for the upcoming period when a regent would rule. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who had managed to survive court politics for decades, was now beaten by the Protestant group. In a final show of Henry's lasting cruelty, Norfolk was sentenced to be executed for treason in the dying king's name. However, Norfolk ended up surviving because Henry died before the execution could happen. January the 27th, 1547, was the start of Henry's final breakdown. People who were there said the king had a seizure that was so strong that his attendants had to hold him down to keep him from hurting himself. After the seizure was over, Henry had trouble speaking, and the right side of his body was partly paralyzed. This was clear proof of what today's doctors would call a major stroke. The court doctors, knowing very well that they could be disgraced or even executed if they couldn't save the king, worked desperately to bring him back. They put hot irons on his skin and poured bitter medicines down his throat. During this whole time, entry to the king's bedroom was tightly controlled by his most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This secrecy was not just about protecting the king's dignity, it was also practical. If news got out that the king was about to die, it could lead to early attempts to seize power or even an invasion from another country. Cranmer made sure that only the most necessary helpers were allowed in, and they all had to promise to stay completely silent about the king's health. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, was kept away at certain important times. As January moved into the days that followed, the king floated between being awake and being unconscious. In the short times when he was clear-minded, Henry was said to have shown increasing fear about facing God's judgment. The man who had ordered the executions of 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of regular people, was now facing his own death with growing terror. According to the diary of one attendant, the king was heard mumbling prayers and asking for forgiveness in his sleep. This was a huge change from the unbending ruler who had changed England's religion by his own strong will. Court papers show the amazing efforts that were made to protect what was left of Henry's dignity in his last days. As his body failed, teams of servants worked in shifts to handle the unpleasant jobs of cleaning and moving the king's enormous body. The sores on his legs had gotten so bad that it was said you could see the bone through the dead flesh. The smell got so strong that anyone entering the king's room had to carry a scented handkerchief. The windows were thrown open to the cold winter air whenever the king was unconscious. By the end of the month, even the fancy story that the king might get better could not be kept up inside the court. Archbishop Cranmer was called to the king's bedside in a hurry as Henry's breathing got weaker and weaker. Stories from that time tell how the king, who could no longer speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he trusted in Christ for salvation, rather than in the church ceremonies he had once promoted. It is said that Henry squeezed the archbishop's hand with the last of his strength before he fell into his final coma. This touching detail is often used by Protestant historians as proof that he converted on his deathbed. The king died before the sun came up on January 28, 1547. Even after he died, Henry's huge body commanded attention in the royal room. His corpse was a horrifying monument to a life of overindulgence and pain. The official reason for his death was listed simply as the body naturally breaking down, but modern medical experts believe it was a deadly mix of heart failure, blood poisoning from his infected wounds, and problems from what was likely type 2 diabetes. What was more amazing than his death was the incredible plot of silence that came after it. The Privy Council kept his death a secret for 3 whole days while they secured power for the young Edward VI. This delay was vital for making sure the change of power went smoothly. While Henry's body was lying in his room, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, and the new king's uncle, acted quickly and ruthlessly to take control. Secret meetings were held, important castles were secured, and anyone who might challenge him was dealt with before the public was told of Henry's death on January 31st. When the church bells in London finally rang to signal the king's death, Edward Seymour had already been made Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset. He was now effectively the ruler of England, governing for his young nephew. Getting rid of Henry's body created special problems that tell us a lot about both Tudor funeral customs and the king's physical state when he died. Court documents show that the king's body started to break down very quickly, probably because of the serious infections he already had. Embalmers worked frantically to prepare the body. They took out his internal organs and filled the empty spaces with sweet-smelling herbs and spices. Even these professionals were reportedly stunned by the condition of Henry's organs, especially his sick liver and swollen heart. Henry's coffin had to be specially built to fit his massive size. It was reportedly almost twice as wide as a normal coffin for a nobleman. It was so heavy that it needed a stronger platform and more people to carry it. During the time he was laid out for public viewing at Whitehall, people who were there said that the lead-lined coffin actually burst open because of the pressure of gases building up inside the decaying body. This caused fluids to leak out onto the floor of the chapel. This gruesome event was quickly hidden, but stories say that dogs licked up the liquid, creating a final, disgusting humiliation for a king who had been obsessed with his own majesty. The funeral parade to Windsor Castle on February 16th was one last chance for the Tudor government to show off Henry's power, even after his death. Horses draped in black cloth pulled the giant coffin through streets filled with people mourning. There were also figures of the king that showed him as he looked in his best years, not the swollen man he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was buried next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a male heir and the only one who had been lucky enough to die from issues during childbirth. Before Henry's feelings for her could change and she could fall out of his favor, the reality of Henry's decaying body was a sharp contrast to the heroic story that was already being created about his reign. Court painters like Hans Holbein had created the lasting image of Henry as the powerful, broad-shouldered man, standing with his legs apart and his hands on his hips, staring boldly at anyone who looked at him. This carefully created image had little to do with the disease-ridden body that was now sealed under the stone floor of Windsor. Yet, it would be this image of Henry VIII that would stick in people's minds for hundreds of years. Henry's will showed his final efforts to control the future even after his death. The 30-page document clearly stated the order of who would rule next. First, his son Edward, then Mary, the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and finally Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. This clear plan for succession, although it was briefly interrupted when Lady Jane Grey ruled for 9 days, was eventually followed exactly as Henry had wanted. The king's influence over England after his death would continue through all 3 of his children, who would each rule as a Tudor monarch before the family line ended with Queen Elizabeth III's death in 1603. More important right away were the plans Henry made for who would have power while Edward was still a child. The king set up a regency council of 16 men who were supposed to govern together until Edward turned 18. This balanced plan showed Henry's fear of any single nobleman gaining too much control over his son. However, his careful plans were quickly overturned when Edward Seymour outsmarted the other council members and was named Lord Protector just days after Henry died. The fact that Henry's wishes were ignored so quickly showed the limits of even a king's power once he was dead and no longer feared. The medical story of Henry's last days still fascinates historians and doctors today. His symptoms have been diagnosed after the fact as proof of everything from syphilis to scurvy, though the strongest evidence points to type 2 diabetes made worse by a chronic bone infection. The king's medical records show that his doctors tried increasingly desperate treatments, from putting live pigeons cut in half on his rotting sores to giving him experimental drinks made of gold and crushed precious stones. These expensive but useless treatments show both the limits of Tudor medicine and the extreme things that were done for a patient as important as Henry. Maybe the most touching things were the personal items found in the king's rooms after he died. Among the expected signs of royal power, like jeweled daggers, official seals, and letters from other countries, servants found a small, locked box. Inside were more personal things: a tiny portrait of Jane Seymour, a piece of hair thought to be from his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's prayer book written by hand, which might have belonged to Elizabeth before her mother was executed. These items that show his human side give us a look at the man behind the monster, suggesting that even as his body and mind were failing, Henry held on to some connection to his family and his own feelings. The king's death caused immediate changes in the political landscape that would determine England's future for many years. Conservative Catholic groups that had held on to some power during Henry's last years were suddenly pushed aside as Edward Seymour created a government that was strongly Protestant. Archbishop Cranmer, who had given the last rites to the dying king, now pushed forward with religious changes that Henry had been more careful about. The first English Book of Common Prayer was published just 2 years after Henry died, moving England further toward Protestant beliefs than the king himself had ever wanted. Henry's own complicated religious views — he had broken away from Rome but kept many Catholic traditions — left a confusing legacy. This allowed both Protestant and Catholic groups to claim that he was on their side. Protestant reformers focused on his rejection of the Pope's authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of certain Catholic beliefs and his opposition to Lutheran ideas. This religious confusion would lead to conflicts throughout the reigns of all 3 of his children, as England swung between extreme Protestantism under Edward, a return to Catholicism under Mary, and finally, a middle path established by Elizabeth. The king's death also signaled a major shift in Tudor propaganda. Having built up the image of Henry as England's protector against foreign enemies and the tyranny of the Pope, royal publicists now had to figure out how to pass this authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of the young Edward VI were intentionally made to look like his father's famous stance, showing the boy with the same wide-legged pose and defiant look that were characteristic of Henry's most famous portraits. Court events stressed the idea of continuity, and court members were expected to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same respect they had shown his father. Outside of politics, Henry's death had an impact on everyday life all over England. For almost 40 years, he had been the face of royal power, and his personality and decisions had directly influenced government down to the local level. His death created a void in people's minds as much as in politics. Church records from early 1547 show that people were very worried about the future, with more reports of prophetic dreams, strange signs in the sky, and even supposed ghost sightings. For people who saw religious meaning in everything, the death of such a powerful king naturally felt like it could be the end of the world. The reactions of other countries to Henry's death showed the complicated position England now held in Europe. The French ambassador reported that King Francis of France truly mourned for his dear brother of England, even though they had often been in conflict. Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, was more practical. He looked at the strategic possibilities, wondering if England, ruled by a child king, might be open to invasion or new alliance. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry a decade earlier, reportedly had a mass said for the king's soul. This was a diplomatic move that acknowledged Henry's importance, while also reasserting the Catholic Church's claim on his spiritual fate. The physical place where Henry died, his private rooms in Whitehall Palace, almost immediately became filled with historical importance. Court members reported feeling hesitant to go into the rooms where the king had suffered in his final days. Rumors of strange noises and unexplainable cold spots fed superstitious fears. The young King Edward VI reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed and demanded that new rooms be made ready for him. This emotional aftermath shows the traumatic effect of Henry's death on those who had seen his decline, many of whom had spent their lives trying to predict and please his unpredictable moods. Henry's medical case is one of the best documented royal deaths in history, giving us valuable information about Tudor medical practices. His doctors kept detailed records of the treatments they gave him in his final months. These records survived because they were kept as proof that everything possible had been done to save the king. These documents show a mix of ancient medical ideas with new Renaissance methods, such as using heated cups to draw out bad humors, plant-based medicines from classical texts, and even early forms of water therapy. The fact that these methods did not work shows the limitations that even the most advanced doctors of that time faced. The king's obsession with his image after death included detailed instructions for his tomb, which was planned to be a huge monument that would be much larger than any other royal burial site in England. Henry ordered complex designs with 40 life-sized bronze statues and a tall central structure with a statue of himself on horseback at the top. This grand plan showed both his large ego and his worry about how history would see him. Ironically, the huge project was never finished because of a lack of money, and the planned bronze figures were later melted down during the English Civil War, something that would have made the image-conscious king furious. Right after Henry's death, there was a rush for people to either get close to or distance themselves from his legacy. Court members who had lost favor in his final years came out of hiding, while others who had been in his good graces scrambled to form new alliances for protection. Archives hold sad letters from royal servants who suddenly found themselves without a job after decades of tending to the king's personal needs. For many, it was impossible to adapt. The skills needed to handle Henry's unpredictable temper were not very useful in the more controlled court of Edward VI. Some former favorites took their own lives in the months after the king's death, unable to handle the quick changes in power. Perhaps most importantly, Henry's death marked the start of a major change in English government. It moved from being ruled by an absolute king whose personal desires dictated policy to more cooperative ways of sharing power between the monarch and the nobility. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, did not have Henry's frightening personal authority and had to rely more on the approval of the council. This change, although it was temporarily undone during Mary's reign, set a pattern for limiting royal power that would grow under Elizabeth and eventually lead to England's unique path of constitutional development. In a strange twist, Henry's death weakened the very idea of absolute monarchy that he had spent his life building up. The king's final illness became a topic of deep medical study, with each new generation of doctors looking at his symptoms again based on the knowledge of their time. Victorian doctors, who had strong moral views on disease, often pointed to syphilis as a likely cause. Seeing Henry's condition as a punishment from God for his sexual behavior. Specialists in the early 20th century focused more on metabolic problems, suggesting that gout and diabetes were the main issues. Modern medical historians have suggested more complicated diagnoses, including rare genetic conditions that would explain both his physical decline and his mental changes, as well as chronic brain injury from multiple jousting accidents in his younger years. The way Henry's personal belongings were handled gives us a revealing look into Tudor views on death and memory. Court records show how items that the king had touched in his final days were treated with special respect. Some were kept almost like religious relics, even though the official Protestant church rejected such practices. His last set of night clothes, stained with his body fluids, was formally burned under the watch of Archbishop Cranmer. This was an act that combined practical cleanliness with symbolic meaning. More valuable items, including his large collection of astronomical tools and maps, were carefully listed before being given out according to his will or kept for Edward's education. Henry's death put his surviving wives and children in dangerous situations that required them to carefully navigate court politics. Catherine Parr, his widow, put on a show of dignified public mourning while privately moving very quickly to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a marriage she had put off while Henry was alive. 9-year-old Edward, now king in name but heavily controlled by his Seymour uncles, wrote about his father's death in his journal with a shocking lack of emotion, suggesting the distant personal relationship between the father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters had their own difficulties in the new system. Mary, at 31, remained a devoted Catholic and felt increasingly distant from Edward's Protestant changes. Elizabeth, just 13, had to handle court life with extreme care, her position made weak by her mother's execution and the ongoing questions about her legitimacy. Both princesses would eventually become queen, as Henry had promised. But the journey would be full of danger, with Mary barely escaping execution during a rebellion and Elizabeth being imprisoned in the Tower of London during her sister's reign. The stories of Henry's final hours show the incredible loneliness that even the most powerful king faces at the moment of death. Even though he was surrounded by doctors, attendants, and court members, records from that time suggest Henry faced his end essentially alone, separated from others by both his royal position and the uniquely personal experience of dying. Archbishop Cranmer, who tried to offer spiritual comfort, reportedly got little response other than that final squeeze of his hand. The king, who had demanded complete obedience in his kingdom, found himself ultimately making his final journey by himself, a powerful reminder that death is the great equalizer. The year after Henry's death showed just how much his personality had controlled English government. Administrative records reveal a large number of decisions that had been waiting for his personal approval. Many of these were on matters that could have been handled by lower officials, but were brought to the king because of a culture of extreme respect. Under Edward's regency, government procedures had to be changed to work without the king's direct input. This change, while chaotic at first, eventually made the institutions of government stronger, developing bureaucratic systems that could function without the monarch's personal involvement. Henry's grand funeral procession was his final performance in England's public show of power. Accounts from that time describe horses draped in black velvet, heralds carrying ceremonial weapons, and a life-sized wax figure of the king in full royal attire on top of his coffin. The artificial body stood in for the decaying real one hidden underneath. This procession moved from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands of his subjects to see this last display of Tudor majesty. The careful planning of the event showed a deep anxiety about the political transition, using ceremony to reinforce the idea that while the king may die, the monarchy itself would continue. The court doctors who had not been able to save the king faced an uncertain future afterward. Medical records show that some quickly found jobs with other noble families. while others were professionally shunned for their connection to Henry's failed treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had been courageous enough to tell Henry that his death was near when others were too afraid, used this display of bravery to continue his royal service under Edward VI. The king's apothecaries were especially scrutinized, and lists of the medicines they provided during Henry's final illness were checked for potential carelessness or, even worse, for deliberately speeding up his death. The scientific study of Henry's remains, which happened during renovations of the vault in the 1800s, offered intriguing clues about his physical state at death. Workers reported finding an enormous skeleton that matched Henry's known height, with signs of severe joint damage, especially in the legs. Modern forensic analysis applied to historical medical records suggests that Henry may have reached the incredible weight of about 400 pounds at his death, with a waist size of over 50 inches. This extreme obesity, along with poor blood flow in his legs and the open sores described in accounts from his time, would have created the perfect environment for the blood poisoning that likely played a part in his death. Perhaps what is most telling about Henry's final days is what they reveal about the limits of power. The king who had changed England's religion, executed queens and nobles without hesitation, and built a navy that would one day command the world's oceans, was completely powerless against the breakdown of his own body. Court records describe Henry flying into a rage at his doctors, demanding that they make him healthy again through the sheer force of his royal authority. This pointless struggle against biological fact highlights the central contradiction of absolute monarchy, the unavoidable weakness of even the most powerful human body, to disease, decay, and death. The religious uncertainty around Henry's death provided an opportunity for different stories to be told that served various political ends. Protestant writers focused on moments of evangelical clarity on his deathbed, while Catholic writers outside of England described a king tormented by regret for breaking with Rome. In truth, the evidence suggests that Henry maintained his unique religious position until the very end, seeing himself as the supreme head of the English Church while still rejecting key Protestant ideas. This complex religious view, which was essentially Catholic in its ceremonies but rejected the Pope's authority, reflected the king's lifelong habit of changing institutions to fit his personal needs rather than following outside rules. The financial fallout from Henry's death was felt far beyond the court. Financial records show that the new Regency government inherited a treasury that was severely drained and a currency that had been devalued, a result of Henry's costly foreign wars and extravagant personal spending. By some calculations, Henry spent the modern equivalent of over 200 million pounds on his palaces alone. This financial crisis forced Edward Seymour to continue Henry's unpopular policy of selling off monastery lands, which sped up one of the biggest transfers of property ownership in English history. The economic effects of Henry's overspending would lead to inflation and social problems throughout his children's reigns. Henry's physical decline was a powerful symbol for people at the time, many of whom saw the king's body as a representation of the nation itself. Just as medieval political thought had described the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers saw Henry's decaying flesh as a sign of deeper problems within the kingdom. Surviving sermons from 1547 show preachers making direct connections between the king's infected legs and what they saw as moral decay in English society. This symbolic interpretation became politically useful during Edward's reign, as reformers argued that just as Henry's body had needed drastic action, so too did England's religious life need to be purified. The last days of Henry VIII mark a unique point where medieval and early modern ideas about kingship clashed. On one hand, the elaborate death ceremonies, the concern with a proper burial, and the anxiety over who would succeed him. all followed ancient patterns of royal death that went back centuries. On the other hand, the detailed medical records, the legal exactness of Henry's will, and the continued functioning of the government represented more modern ways of handling state power. Henry, therefore, died with a foot in two different eras. He was the last English king to have truly medieval-style authority. But he was also a monarch who had pioneered the state bureaucracy that would define future governments. In the end, what makes Henry VIII's death so captivating is not just the gruesome physical details or its political importance, but what it shows us about the human experience itself. The king who had ruled his time through the sheer force of his will ended his life facing the same limitations as the poorest of his subjects. Accounts from that time suggest that Henry felt moments of deep existential fear in his final days, facing judgment not as a king, but simply as a man. As the Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly reminded him while giving him the last rites, "You are about to appear where no titles bear weight and no earthly power offers protection." In that final, human weakness, perhaps England's most infamous king found a connection with his people that he had never achieved during his reign.